0746 hours, January 17th, 1991, Al-Qum's Air Base, Libya. The early sun shimmered over concrete revetments. Dust clung to the control room's tinted glass. Major Vasily Morozov stood with arms folded, watching the radar sweep rotate like a metronome. His uniform still bore the red piping of the Soviet Air Defense Forces. He had spent 9 years teaching foreign crews how to kill American aircraft. Below, a Libyan SA-6 battery sat ready. 5 crewmen, trained under Soviet doctrine, rehearsed the launch checklist by heart. Then it happened. A sudden ping, fast mover inbound, no IF, altitude low, speed supersonic. Lock, the operator shouted. Missile away. Seconds later, a second launch. The SAMs arced skyward, trailing white fury. Morozov leaned closer to the glass, eyes narrowing. The radar lost lock. The missiles missed. And then a sharp beep. New tone, unknown signature. Fast, very fast. Impact. A plume of fire bloomed on the perimeter. The radar truck vanished. The HARM missile had found its mark. Morozov froze. The battery followed Soviet protocol: perfectly activate radar, acquire target, launch. It didn't matter. They had turned on the radar to fight, and it signed their death warrant. A second site nearby suffered the same fate. 2 missiles, 2 launches, 2 failures, 2 radars burned. There were no dogfights, no evasions, no countermeasures. The aircraft they tried to kill were already gone. The missiles that killed them had launched from beyond the horizon, guided by emissions they never meant to reveal. Major Morozov turned away from the smoke column and muttered, "We trained them to strike jets. No one trained us what to do when jets strike first." They had followed the playbook. The game had changed. Frunz Military Academy. Moscow. Winter 1988. Inside the vaulted lecture halls of the Soviet Union's most prestigious command school, certainty reigned. The chalk squeaked across the board as instructors diagrammed layered air defenses, interlocking radar zones, engagement loops, missile envelopes. Future generals sat in rigid rows, memorizing the sequence that would deny NATO the skies. This was the temple of doctrine, and doctrine said the skies were impassable. Soviet air defense theory was clear: NATO will not risk low-altitude penetration, too costly. SAM saturation ensures airspace denial at every tier. Suppression of enemy air defenses. SEAD is slow, incomplete, and vulnerable. A colonel pointed to a chart radar coverage blankets layered like onion skin. "No aircraft outruns engagement radar," he declared. Textbooks cited engagements over Hanoi and Haiphong. Losses tallied like proof. Instructors quoted missile success rates as absolute truths. "Our systems are proven. Our radars cannot be fooled. Electronic warfare is Western superstition." Cadets repeated these lines during exercises. They practiced switch-on drills with precision. Radar illumination, lock, launch, kill, credential drop, number 1, biulut. General Mikhail Vorobyov, author of the Integrated Air Defense Curriculum. His textbook opened with a line, "To turn on a radar is to dominate the sky." There was no room for uncertainty. The doctrine had been reinforced for decades. Layered depth meant survival. Range meant superiority. Radar meant certainty. But every truth they taught came with a fatal assumption: that NATO would follow the old rules, that air war would be detectable, gradual, symmetrical. They taught invulnerability. They never trained for invisibility. Soviet air defense doctrine was a fortress built not from steel, but belief. Its foundation lay in 4 principles, passed from one training manual to the next, like sacred scripture. First, depth equals defense. A layered defense would outlast any strike. Surface-to-air missiles were arranged in concentric shells, short, medium, and long-range batteries stacked to trap intruders. If the first layer failed, the second would catch them. If not the second, then the third. Second quantity equals redundancy. No Western force could destroy every launcher, every radar. With enough systems spread across terrain, even NATO saturation strikes would exhaust themselves before breaking through. Third range equals survivability. Soviet doctrine believed in hitting targets from afar. The longer the reach, the safer the battery. Systems like the S-200 could fire from 250 kilometers away. Training emphasized engaging before the enemy could engage you. Fourth radar equals certainty. To see was to control. Every kill chain began with a ping radar, lit the sky. Found the target, tracked its path. Without radar, there was no kill. With radar, there was order. These weren't just technical parameters, they were dogma. Credential drop number 2, Colonel Yegor Polivanov, SAM Regiment instructor, led war games across East Germany. He once told trainees, "As long as your radar is alive, so are you." But every assumption was built for predictable wars over flat terrain against visible aircraft under symmetrical conditions. They assumed static battlefields, coordinated salvos, and engagements at known altitudes. No one asked what if the battlefield wasn't symmetrical? What if the enemy was invisible? What if range didn't protect, but exposed? They trained to see. They never asked what if the enemy was never seen. 3:22 hours, January 17th, 1991, Western Iraq. An early warning radar operator watches the green sweep. Blip, movement, fast, low, too low. He hesitates. Doctrine says wait for altitude. Let the target climb, then light the radar, then fire. 0322-14, lock signal engaged. Radar beams flood the sky. 0322-15, signal disappears, not jammed, not evaded. 0322-16, warning tone, unknown signal inbound. 0322-17, impact. The HARM missile hits square. Radar vehicle erupts into fire. 2 crewmen die. 1 stumbles from the wreckage burned, but alive. 10 kilometers away, another site repeats the sequence. 032302. Target detected. 032306. Radar active. 032308. Lock achieved. 032310. Radar goes blank. 032313. Missile strike. No survivors. Operators followed their manuals. They executed engagement loops taught for 20 years. Lock on, track, fire. But the returns they chased were phantoms. And the American missiles chasing them didn't need locks, just emissions. Credential drop, Mer-3. A Soviet field advisor debriefed 1 surviving crew member. "We followed the sequence, exactly as trained. His report concluded procedures were flawless. The enemy was faster than the procedure. Soviet doctrine demanded radars wait. Fire only with certainty. Confirm the track, lock with confidence, then launch." But every second that passed was another second for the enemy to see them, target them, and fire back with missiles that needed no lock, just light. The operators obeyed. The operators died. They turned the radar on to fight and died the second they did. Back in Moscow, the early reports raised eyebrows but not alarms. 2 Libyan sites destroyed. Several Iraqi radars hit. Losses were expected, the analyst said. Normal friction at war's start. No doctrinal breach. No systemic failure. Excuses came quickly. One general claimed, "Libyans are undisciplined. They activate radars too early." Another insisted, "Iraqis misunderstood the engagement sequence." Marshal Akrameyev, former chief of the General Staff, reviewed the kill data and declared the equipment is sound. The users are not. An internal briefing circulated across Frunze Academy reports indicate poor adherence to activation timing and lock discipline. No change in training protocols required. Credential Drops number 4, Akrameyev, had overseen the very manuals being challenged. His legacy was embedded in every chart, every procedure. To admit failure wasn't just professional, it was ideological. One colonel, off record, said what others were thinking. If we accept the system failed, we admit everything we taught was wrong. Instead, they shifted blame downward. Errors in execution, poor discipline, inadequate training by client states. But this wasn't a rogue battery or a panicked crew. The procedures were followed. Radar activation was correct. Target lock was achieved. And they still died. Because the doctrine had failed to imagine a world where turning on the radar was the same as pulling the trigger on yourself. But in Moscow, the conclusion held, the system is intact. The operators failed it. They blamed the hands. They never questioned the tool. In the days that followed, a new theory emerged inside Soviet command circles. The Americans weren't defeating the system, they were deceiving it. Analysts proposed that stealth was only part of the story. The true advantage, they claimed, lay in false signals decoys. The theory U.S. aircraft projected phantom radar signatures, fake returns scattered across the spectrum. A SAM site might see 3 targets, lock onto the wrong one, and expose itself in the process. The real jet, meanwhile, remained hidden or redirected. Suddenly, the failures weren't about doctrine, they were about deception. Training units at Krasnodar and Kalinin began revising simulator drills. Operators practiced distinguishing between ghost signals and real targets. Charts were redrawn to account for signal ambiguity zones. Instructors warned cadets to delay lock until absolute certainty was achieved. They believed they had adapted. They hadn't. Because the American missiles weren't fakes. They weren't illusions. They were harm missiles, homing on real radar signals with deadly speed. There was no trick, just tracking, just silence and then impact. The Soviet false solution redirected attention away from what mattered reaction time. While the command focused on chasing ghosts, the real threat was the physics of the engagement loop. A radar turned on. The missile saw it. The missile hit. No decoy, no spoof, no magic. Credential drop number 5 implied 1. GRU radar engineer reportedly noted, the ghost theory comforts the instructors. It explains away the speed, but the truth was brutal. They trained to find deception. But they never trained to survive the truth. When radar decoys failed to explain the devastation, Soviet theorists proposed a second false solution, one more complex, more technical, and more comfortable. They blamed communications. Specifically, they claimed that NATO AWACS aircraft were spoofing command nets, impersonating friendly signals to mislead radar sites into revealing positions. The theory gained traction. After all, the Americans had advanced ESM electronic support measures. If they could imitate encrypted Soviet signals or jam GCI frequencies, they might induce operators to activate radars prematurely or target decoys instead of real aircraft. In response, Soviet training pivoted again. Cadets were drilled in signal verification. New exercises focused on comms discipline. Operators were warned. No action without source authentication. Doctrine emphasized isolation of decision-making, no external input unless triple confirmed. It felt like progress. It wasn't. Because the Americans weren't spoofing voice. They weren't issuing false commands. They didn't need to. They were listening, not speaking. AWACS aircraft hovered beyond the radar horizon, absorbing every frequency pulse. When a Soviet-aligned radar blinked online, even for seconds, it lit up like a beacon. And somewhere, a harm missile already hung in the sky, just waiting for a signal to chase. By the time Soviet officers secured their communications protocols, Their radars were already gone. One frustrated instructor summarized the failure in a closed-door session. "We told them to verify every word, but the Americans never spoke. They sealed their voice channels. They encrypted their orders. They hardened their networks. It didn't matter, because the Americans weren't hacking the signal. They were killing the source. They secured their voice. The Americans never needed to speak." By February 1991, the GRU and Soviet Air Defense Command launched a classified forensic initiative. Codenamed Zaslan 5, its goal was simple: understand why the radars were dying so fast. They collected everything: radar logs from Iraqi and Libyan batteries, missile fragments from destroyed sites, even electromagnetic recordings from surviving signal intelligence units. Analysts pored over waveforms. Engineers ran engagement simulations. What they found was terrifying. In engagement after engagement, the American HARM missiles didn't require target tracking. They simply waited, passive homing. When a radar emitted even briefly, the missile locked. Average time from radar activation to impact under 5 seconds. Soviet radar doctrine required an 8 to 12-second window to lock, confirm, and launch. The missiles were halfway there before the operators even reached fire. A senior GRU radar analyst wrote in a now declassified memo, "By the time our systems react, the missile is already inbound." The report concluded that Soviet engagement loops were not just outdated, they were tactically suicidal. Credential drop number 6 implied Colonel Viktor Lisov, GRU Technical Division, recommended immediate suspension of legacy lock-on procedures for mobile SAM units. His proposal was ignored. The report also revealed that most destroyed radars had followed procedures perfectly. They had waited the correct interval. They had executed lock correctly. They had died anyway, because American suppression wasn't about jamming or deception. It was about tempo. Kill the radar before it kills. Every second mattered. The Soviet system was still teaching minutes. They had built an air defense theory on sequence, patience, control. The Americans introduced speed, precision, and silence. They wrote the rules for one kind of war. This wasn't it. The Americans didn't bring better pilots to Desert Storm. They brought better systems, and those systems made Soviet training obsolete overnight. Technology 1 F-117 Nighthawk, plus low RCS design Soviet radar doctrine, assumed aircraft would reflect at least 0.11 mt2 of radar cross-section. The F-117 reflected less than 0.01 mt2, smaller than a bird. Radar screens showed clutter. The threat was hidden inside the noise. Result: radar couldn't find what it couldn't see. Technology 2 AGM-88 HARM missiles. Soviet missiles chased planes. HARM missiles chased radars. They didn't require radar from the launch platform, just emissions from the target. Once a radar lit up, the HARM locked. It needed no confirmation, no second chance. Result: radar activation became suicide. Technology 3 AWACS Plus, CAD coordination, Soviet doctrine relied on fixed SAM placements with delayed reactions. The U.S. built dynamic kill chains. AWACS scanned the sky, relayed emitter locations to strike packages in real time. F-4G Wild Weasels received targets before the enemy knew they were seen. Result: every radar pulse was instantly mapped, tracked, and tasked. Technology 4 Digital Terrain Following Plus. Low altitude ingress, Soviets taught below 300 meters. Aircraft can't fly reliably. American jets flew at 100 meters. Terrain matching radar let them follow hills and valleys like a river. They slipped under radar coverage. Result: defenses pointed the wrong way. Technology 5 Suppression, not destruction. Soviet doctrine aimed to destroy threats. Americans realized they didn't need to destroy every SAM, just blind them. Once a site fired or lit up, it was suppressed, bypassed, or ignored. Result speed replaced saturation. Credential drop. MER-6 General Chuck Horner, architect of the Desert Storm Air Campaign, said we didn't need to destroy the shield. We just turned it off. Each technology wasn't just superior, it erased the assumptions Soviet training depended on. They taught radar supremacy. The Americans turned radar into a liability. They built defenses. The Americans built weapons that punished defense. They built walls. The Americans flew through them at 800 km/h, January 17, 1991. The Soviet-designed air defense network in Iraq begins its war and ends it almost instantly. 0230, a radar near Al-Qut lights up. 0231, harm away. 0232, sight gone. No survivors. 0234, western flank activates SAM sight tracks low-altitude blip. 0235, radar locked. 0235-08, harm inbound. 0235-14, battery destroyed. 0240, 17 radar sites have activated. 0245, 11 no longer transmit. So 250, strike aircraft passed through airspace untouched. Over 200 Soviet-designed SAM sites were deployed across Iraq. In the first 72 hours, more than half were neutralized. By the end of the first week, less than 25% remained functional. 0 American aircraft lost in that initial wave to radar-guided missiles. The suppression was absolute. Operators followed their training, lock sequence, fire window, radar pulse intervals. They executed flawlessly, and they were systematically deleted. Reversal lines. They trained to track. They were destroyed before they could see. They trained to deny airspace. They died guarding the empty sky. They trained to engage. They became the targets. Credential drop. A post-battle review compiled by Soviet analysts censored at the time concluded legacy doctrine caused legacy deaths. It wasn't failure in combat. It was perfect execution of an obsolete system. The suppression wasn't just tactical, it was philosophical. The Americans didn't disable a few radars. They dismantled an entire worldview. They didn't outfight Soviet doctrine. They ended it. The system didn't fail. It executed. That was the failure. When the smoke cleared, Moscow was forced to confront not a tactical mistake, but a systemic collapse. The battlefield had exposed 4 core failures, philosophical, not just procedural. 1, prediction versus adaptation. Soviet doctrine depended on pre-calculated outcomes. Radar zones, missile envelopes, sequence trees if A, then B. But the Americans adapted in real time. Their systems sensed, shared, and responded dynamically. The Soviets wrote scripts. The Americans played jazz. 2. Range versus reaction. Longer-range missiles were supposed to mean safer cruise, but long-range radars took longer to sweep, longer to track, and longer to lock. In those seconds, they died. The Americans didn't need range. They needed speed, and they had it. 3. Depth and precision. Soviet theory taught defense-in-depth layers of redundancy, each designed to absorb punishment. But the Americans didn't strike every layer. They struck the one node that made the rest irrelevant. Blind a radar, and the entire defense goes dark. 4. Training versus execution. Soviet schools taught doctrine, sequence, repetition. American systems allowed pilots and missiles to respond without permission. Speed replaced process. The Americans weren't trained harder. They were equipped smarter. One internal report, never released to press, summarized it with chilling clarity. Our war was taught in layers. Theirs arrived in milliseconds. Credential drop. A defector later said his instructors taught with certainty, but trained for a world that no longer existed. Moscow had built a system designed for control, not chaos, for structure, not speed. And when the war came, it didn't ask for permission. They taught systems. The Americans taught outcomes. Southern Iraq a scorched valley. The sand still black from impact. What remains of a radar site lies half buried. The antenna mast is snapped. Its dish, once proud and precise,